Let's talk about DUI checkpoints. The United States Supreme Court has ruled that DUI checkpoints are constitutional because the state's interest in maintaining safe roadways outweighs any intrusion upon any individual driver. However, there are certain states that have made checkpoints illegal, so you may want to check with your state to see what the laws are. In Nevada, checkpoints are conducted and they are legal. Law enforcement has to follow certain guidelines and certain laws in order to have a valid DUI checkpoint. For example, the checkpoint must be on the highway in a clearly visible area at least 100 yards away. In other words, if a driver is approaching a checkpoint, they must be able to clearly see that checkpoint from at least 100 yards beyond the checkpoint. Law enforcement must also follow rules such as putting up a large stop sign. They must have a flashing light, and most of these signs and advisories must be placed far enough away for the public to be aware that there's a checkpoint upcoming. There should be a warning sign that says police stop, and in the city or in urban areas that needs to be placed at least 700 feet prior to the entrance to the checkpoint. What happens when you are approaching a checkpoint? What should you do? If you haven't been drinking, you're just going to have to slow down and talk to the officer. If you have been drinking, what should you do if you're approaching a checkpoint? Well, the first thing you should do is see if there's a way to turn around or turn off to avoid the checkpoint. Because the laws allow or create such a distance, it may be possible, depending on where the checkpoint is set up, that you have a chance to turn down a different road or to avoid the checkpoint. If that's not possible, then when you approach the checkpoint, you need to do everything possible not to raise the officer's suspicion. So make sure you pull up slowly. Don't speed through the checkpoint because that's a crime. Make sure you follow the officer's instructions and respond to the officer in a way that won't give rise to suspicion. Obviously, try not to breathe into the officer's face. If you've been drinking, you may need to provide your license and registration or identify yourself. Do not consent to a search of your vehicle. So use common sense when you approach a checkpoint and don't do anything that would give the officer a reason to direct you to a secondary checkpoint. If you go to a secondary checkpoint, that's when the officers have established reasonable suspicion, either because they smelled alcohol in your breath or they noticed other signs of intoxication, for example, if you're slurring your speech, or if your eyes are bloodshot or glassy. Once you get to a second checkpoint, that's when you need to be even more careful. If the officer asks you you've been drinking, you should obviously say no or decline to answer that question politely. If you admit that you've been drinking, even if you say, I had a beer or I had 2 glasses of wine, that's going to give the officer a reason to direct you to a secondary stop where they may ask you to step out of the vehicle to conduct field sobriety tests. My advice would be not to admit that you've been drinking because that will be used against you later on. If the officer will request that you do field sobriety tests, you should also decline to do field sobriety tests, and you should also decline to do a preliminary breath test, unless, of course, you haven't been drinking, in which case, go ahead and do the preliminary breath test. If the officer asks you additional questions or you believe you're about to be arrested, don't make any further statements and tell them you want to speak to a lawyer, or just don't make any statements until you've gotten transported to jail and booked and released, in which case you'll need to contact a lawyer right away. What are the consequences for refusing to take the field sobriety test or refusing to take a preliminary breath test? Keep in mind that a preliminary breath test is conducted on the side of the road or at the scene where you're being questioned or where you've been detained. Refusing to take the preliminary breath test, there are no consequences regarding your license. The law allows the officer to arrest you, but if you've gotten to that point already, unless you have had 0 to drink and you're completely sober, you are probably getting arrested anyway. And taking a preliminary breath test is only giving the officer more evidence or more probable cause to use against you. Same goes for the field sobriety tests. You are not required to complete those field sobriety tests. Those sobriety tests are very difficult even for people who are completely sober. So my advice is not to complete or not to perform the field sobriety tests either. The big consequence is once you are arrested and taken to jail, either a breath test or a blood test. If you refuse either of these tests, the officer will have to get a warrant in order to take your blood, in which case you could lose your license for up to a year in Nevada. So that would be the consequence of refusing a breath or blood test when you're at the jail.